Hello, Georgian family. I'm Erica Maldonado-Singh, Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Alumni Relations Team. We're happy to have you with us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion at any point, or you want to watch or listen to it again, you have two options. It will be on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all your favorite podcast platforms, and a link to the video will be on the Dornsife Dialogues page of our website. If you're not already following USC Dornsife on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, please do. We share fascinating research from our scholars and much more. Our handle on all of those platforms is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the Dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Amber Miller.
Welcome back to Dornsife Dialogues. This one's going to be fun. Today, we'll hear about the history and evolution of stand-up comedy and how especially challenging it is these days to be in the business of being funny. When I first heard that stand-up comedy would be our topic, I immediately thought back to when I was first young and single living in New York City. My wing woman was a stand-up comedian. She made going to bad events not just cringeworthy, but also hilarious, because seeing awkward interactions through her eyes showed me the humor and absurdity in pretty much any situation. What she was so good at, and what all the best stand-up comedians have mastered, is revealing and examining vulnerable moments in our life and poking fun at absurdity in ways that everyone can relate to. In this way, stand-up comedy actually has a lot in common with the liberal arts. Pushing boundaries, critiquing and analyzing, finding the universal aspects in our unique stories, and in the process, revealing and celebrating our shared humanity. So I can't wait to hear what our speakers have to say about all of this. Our panel today will be moderated by Kirstin Eggers. Kirstin is an assistant professor of theater practice in comedy performance at the USC School of Dramatic Arts. She is an actor, writer, and comedic performer with extensive television and improv comedy experience. She's also a Trojan alum, holding a BFA in acting from the School of Dramatic Arts, where she won both the Jack Nicholson Award and the Ava Greenwald Award for Outstanding Actor. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kirstin's capable hands to introduce our panel. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Dean Miller. I'm so excited to be here. And I have to say, I remember being young and single also, and how comedy was a really big part of that for me as well. I'm so excited to be here with our panel today of expert scholars and working stand-up comedians. Let me introduce them to you. We have here with us Professor Lanita Jacobs, Associate Professor in the Departments of American Studies and Ethnicity and Anthropology at USC. Among other topics, she studies African-American stand-up comedy, and last year she published her second book, To Be Real, Truth and Racial Authenticity in African-American Stand-up Comedy, which is based on long-term observations and interviews with Black comics from 2001 to 2008. Hi, Lanita. Thanks for being here.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi. Next, we have Wayne Federman. Wayne is an adjunct lecturer at the USC School of Dramatic Arts and a currently working stand-up comedian and actor. He is the author of The History of Stand-Up, From Mark Twain to Dave Chappelle, and last year won a Primetime Emmy Award for producing HBO's George Carlin's American Dream. Hi, Wayne.
Hello. It's nice to be here. And by the way, I'm still single. Let's go.
Yeah. Yes. Let's keep it going. All right. And lastly, we have Cruz Arroyo is a PhD candidate in English at USC Dornsife, currently working on his dissertation titled, I Can't Make This Stuff Up, Fictionality, Autobiography, and Deviance in American Stand-Up Comedy. Hi, Cruz.
Hey, how you doing? Happy to be here.
Good. So the title of our hour here today is Stand-Up Comedy, Its Historic Influence on Society. But I thought we should keep it a little personal just to kick us off here, because stand-up can be very personal. We'll get into that. But I was reflecting on my own comedy experience. This is the last time I'll talk about myself, but I would say as a comic performer, my kind of first big influence was it was a special. I don't know what channel, maybe ABC, and I think it was a Kennedy Center thing, and it was Carol Burnett and Julie Andrews doing a 2-woman comedy show together, and I had a VHS tape of it, and I watched it every day after school. It does not hold up. Please, nobody look it up, as comedy often does not. But it was really important to me as a female comedian, seeing these women really take over the stage, be goofy, and still be quite feminine, and really, really own their comedic senses and really own the stage like that. So that's my share about what kicked me off into this comedy career and this comedy interest. So I would just love to hear just briefly from each of you, maybe something that you can identify as your first or an early influence of seeing some stand-up that maybe set you up for later in your life and your studies and your work now. Lanita, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I will. 2 memories come to mind. They're connected. One is one that we all might be familiar with. Growing up in a household, there'd be Thanksgiving, we go to my uncle's house, and every now and then towards the evening, the adults would descend into the basement, and all of a sudden you just hear laughter, 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 because they were listening to records by people like Nipsey Russell and others. And so that was just glorious to hear your parents and your older relatives laughing in a whole new way. And then my mother must have known something that I didn't know. She's funny, and she appreciates funny, and my dad is a beautiful clown. Anyway, she used to make me laugh. And so you had to get up there and you had to make your family members laugh. You could not work, you had to stop and do it. And I didn't always want to play because I have some really funny siblings, but there was something she was doing in that moment. I better understand it now, but she was just trying to prepare us for this world. Sometimes laughter can set you free.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. Cruz, how about you? An early influence for you?
Yeah, when I think back, I'm transported to high school, and I'm at home, and Paul Mooney is on YouTube, and I'm laughing so hard that I can't breathe. And it was the first time that I ever had watched a stand-up set where it had affected me that much, where I was really gasping for air. I had to pause it. And I just remember being so taken by the power that he had on stage. It was really how unmovable he was and how he was able to affect everybody. And also the content of what he was talking about, how he was able to bring such really hot button issues and yet bring so much grace and power and passion to them. So that had me hooked right then.
Great, thank you. Wayne, how about you?
Well, my experience is pretty similar to Lanita's in that it was an audio version first, and it was, excuse the expression, Bill Cosby's first album called Why Is There Air? Excuse me, not Why Is There Air? Bill Cosby is a very funny fellow, right? Yeah. And then every year we got a new album of his, again, Why Is There Air? Wonderfulness. And so that was my first even hearing what's going on? Who are these people laughing? What is this club he's at? So that intrigued me very early on. And then later I saw on something called the Jerry Lewis Telethon, which was a Labor Day event, a 24-hour telethon. I saw Milton Berle do a stand-up routine for 6 minutes. I was like, oh, is that what Cosby? Okay. And then I put the two together, and then I was off from there. But those are the 2 earliest.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for sharing that little personal story, your personal influence. All right, so let's blow it up here. So we're talking about the influence on society, a huge topic, of course, but it would be lovely to us to kind of, and this is a huge topic, and Wayne, you teach a semester-long class on the history of stand-up. So
correct.
We could cover this for hours and hours and hours, but and you have a book also, which I already mentioned about this. But do you think, Wayne, you could maybe highlight some of the comedians that stand out to you as being since the beginning of what we consider modern stand-up comedy, what you consider to be the most influential? Are there some goalposts that we could highlight that stand out to you?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm going to start early on in the 1800s with four gentlemen, which I refer to as the four forefathers of stand-up, which are in birth order: Artemus Ward, Mark Twain, Burt Williams, and Will Rogers. Those four, almost all stand-up comedy can be traced directly back to those four gentlemen. And then after that, I mean, it's just a slew. There was this incredible woman named Moms Mabley, she was forced to perform on what was called the Chitlin circuit, which was show business was very much segregated even in the North. It wasn't just a Southern thing. And so she was an early stand-up that I think is very important. Obviously, Lenny Bruce, because of the multiple arrests, and then Mort Saul. Cruz knows all about that guy. And then, everything kind of broke open in the 70s when Richard Pryor and George Carlin started doing unedited, completely free speech specials and movies of their stand-up. And then from there, we're Seinfeld right up to, John Mulaney and Dave Chappelle, who I like to talk about quite a bit because he's a very interesting guy and in the history of it all. But those are just a few. I could name another 40, but I don't know if that's close. Lanita, am I close? Am I in the ballpark?
Mhm.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, Lanita, do you want to respond to some of those Wayne mentioned in terms of briefly how they affected society rather than just affecting the field of comedy and how comedy was done or performed? How was it changing people? How was it changing people's minds? Any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Wayne mentioned Burt Williams and Moms Mabley, and I talk about them in my book. There's no way to talk about Black stand-up comedy without it. For those who may not know, I was in the clubs from 2001 to 2008, trying to figure out first what Black comics had to say about 9/11, that's the September 11th terrorist attacks, if at all. But I was after something a little bit more. I was chasing that laughter that I would hear my relatives in that basement. I was chasing that laughter because they were laughing at something that was shared and communal.
Yeah.
And Burt,
did that after 2001.
oh gosh,
right?
we needed it. And although it took a while for folks to start making jokes about it. But when I think about Burt Williams, when I think about Moms Mabley, one, I think about something that Wayne probably knows very well, Cruz too, is that comics bless us with laughter, but on the flip side, there can be tremendous sadness. So Burt Williams, there was another comic who described him as one of the saddest comedians he knew. But if you saw Burt Williams on stage, even if you see him now, tell me if I'm lying, Wayne, he will just make you laugh with his nonverbal, like just the nuance of what he does in blackface,
Yeah.
So in Moms Mabley, she didn't have to wear blackface, in part because Burt Williams helped to push the field so far for Black stand-up comedians. But she did wear this kind of hat and this granny dress. But she would tell people when she was interviewed, ain't no granny, baby. I'm Moms Mabley. I got a split level in the suburbs, baby. Both of them were doing a tremendous work in their day to tell jokes about the racial condition, also aspects of the universal condition, and make Black people laugh from a deep-hearted place, like that gasping that Cruz was talking about. And that's frankly why I was in the clubs all the time, trying to chase the legacy of people like Burt Williams and Moms Mabley, who were able to tap into despair, sadness, hunger, scarcity, but also joy and love and celebration and love.
Thank you. Cruz, I feel like you want to say something.
Yeah, I have a lot to say. Yeah, because I think picking up from what Lanita said, part of where I start my work is, when did comedians start bringing themselves to the stage? When did they start talking about their autobiographical details in themselves? And I start in the 50s, around the 50s and 60s, with what they call the new wave comedians. So Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, Dick Gregory, I would even add Joan Rivers in there, where they were trying to negotiate how to talk about things on stage that matter to them, but really break away from the kind of uniformity that comedy sometimes finds itself in. You know, in the vaudeville eras, there was a lot of plagiarism because you can build your act off of joke books and sketches and skits, right? And then like kind of in the 50s and 60s, there were the tuxedo comedians that were kind of also giving canned jokes. So when it came to the new wave comics, it was, how do I bring a level of autobiography, a level of political insight, a level of the things that insights into things that actually matter to me, but how do I merge that into character? So there was a lot of strategy in the 50s thinking about, how do I bring this kind of new style of comedy to audiences? And Mort Sahl kind of, his trademark was that kind of stream of consciousness, kind of really long-winded style that audiences needed to get used to. It wasn't an automatic, okay, we're on board. There was a little bit of a learning process and trial and error on stage.
I want to talk about I mean, you already mentioned, Lanita, how powerful and important people being together in these rooms together, or laughing together, building community, building joy, and listening to questions that maybe we're not ready, or the society doesn't feel like they're ready to hear. But an important part of comedy is pushing boundaries, right? It creates a little shock in people's systems to wake them up a little bit sometimes on a physiological level almost. I mean, it does. Sound comes out of your mouth in the form of laughter. So I mean, let's talk about why stand-up is so powerful. And we can link it to the many examples of censorship. Wayne brought up Lenny Bruce, maybe the most famous example of censorship. I would love to talk about that and relate it to, again, a huge topic, but what is happening now with people mentioning cancel culture. What are we allowed to do in comedy?
Sure.
Wayne, do you want to kick us off, or Lanita? Yeah.
No, Wayne, go first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just to give a little context to the whole thing, why I think stand-up is powerful is, I was just thinking about this the other day going through Netflix, when you see like a multi-million-dollar movie, or That's an Option, or a television show that costs $15 million an episode, and then right next to it is one person standing on stage with a microphone, and you can click on that, and it's right next to it. So again, stand-up falls under the umbrella of entertainment. These are professionals who are trying to get laughs. That's sort of the mission statement of it. But it also intersects with so many other things that we've already talked about a little bit. Briefly, Lenny Bruce is very important in my mind because and there was other comedians and comedic actors. I mean, Mae West in 1927 went to jail for 10 days for speech crimes, for something she said on stage. So this is, again, we're supposedly have the First Amendment, and it wasn't really until the 70s that all was allowed. But Lenny Bruce, really interesting, was arrested in 4 cities, all liberal cities. This was San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City, for speech crimes. This was in a nightclub. I know this sounds crazy, and for those people who don't know this story, in a nightclub, these are adults who paid money to go in to watch a show on their own volition, and sure enough, because of something he said, and Cruz speaks about it in his paper that he's still writing, that it was mainly because he was attacking the Catholic Church. That was the main, I think, as we look back at it. So there were forces that wanted to basically shut him up. He's a Jewish kid I think he's from Freeport, Long Island, and now he's attacking people's belief systems. So he was arrested, not, protested, not, I got a bad comment or a letter to the editor. He was literally arrested and had to fight these charges. There were local laws that didn't allow obscenity, and he used the language of America. He used street language in his act. So anyway, I could go on and on, but that didn't really end comedians getting arrested by the government until really the 70s, when HBO started doing their HBO on location, which were their 1 hour stand-up specials. So the first one was in 75. And then what's happened, these sort of local obscenity laws sort of melted away. But I'll turn it over to someone else. But that's the basic story of why we still talk about Lenny Bruce. And also his subject matter was not exactly, as Cruz said, was not generic jokes at all. He was talking about dark stuff. He was talking about racism. He was talking about police brutality. He was talking about interracial relationships. He was like really looking at the entire complex fabric of 1950s America.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all I have to say about him.
Yeah. If I can build off
Go
of
ahead,
that.
Cruz,
What's really cool about the Lenny Bruce trials, or what I've learned, is, it's one of the first times where stand-up is brought to trial to really try to figure out, is this a staged antagonism that's meant to move us in some kind of way? Is it a performance? Or is this a real offense going on? Is there something actually here that needs to be contained so that it protects people from harm, right? And part of Bruce's defense was that an actor who was reading a script was not to be held liable for like any obscenity that's in the script. But what the judges found was that since Bruce had written his own material and was performing it as himself, he didn't have those protections, right? So it's the first time where we really are starting to figure out like what's happening here. Is this real? Is it fake? Is it staged? Is it authentic? And that's the kind of hybrid form that stand-up has grown to be.
Lanita, could you, we talked about this a little bit the other day, but could you maybe link these? I mean, people don't get arrested for their comedy anymore, I don't think. But, this has been a huge topic the last few years, maybe even longer, about what comedians should be allowed to do. And, there's a lot of online backlash, et cetera, about what material comedians are tackling. Lanita, can you talk about some current or, recent examples of what censorship is now, or the equivalent of getting arrested by the government? Is it the same?
Sure. And I'll start by just addressing that question that I love so much. What is beautiful about stand-up comedy? Yeah. And part of what's beautiful about stand-up comedy is something that Wayne mentions in his book. He says one of the things that all these comics that have been mentioned before have in common is at the end of the day, they all perform as a single person on stage with a mic, And the beauty for me is what happens when a comedian greets their audience, "Hey, what's up?" And that buzz of the microphone before you hear the audience's reply. I love that sound because you just never know what's possible.
Yeah.
And when I was in the clubs, a lot of them, I was chasing Black stand-up comedy. I was in the Black comedy rooms, Black comedy clubs, the Comedy Union, Effect Tuesdays at the Comedy Store, just wherever Black comedy was. And what was beautiful about it was that, once again, I'm thinking about my parents and family members in the basement, the adults only. A comedian was saying something and it was tapping into something that made people say, "Oh, I know what that feels like." I know what that's about. And in Black comedy, to some extent, they were playing on shared cultural knowledge, which to me as an anthropologist is just amazing. Like that's where I want to be. Jokes about hair. Oh, that says something about the way that Black people deal with the politics and the beauty of hair and all those kinds of things. But then it also can be universal. So when I'm scrolling Netflix and I have to choose between a movie, or I'll say, "Oh, I wonder what's going on with this person." It doesn't matter necessarily what they look like, because all of them are tapping into what is both individual and unique about themselves, but also that thread that kind of binds us all. One thing I will say is you can't talk about Black stand-up comedy without talking about one of the most globally recognized comics of all time, which is now Kevin Hart. And one of my chapters in my book is about him. And as we all know, Kevin Hart got into some issues and was asked to apologize again for some humor that was homophobic that he had apologized for times in his past stand-up. And for that, he lost one of his number one dreams, which was to host the Oscars, because he refused to apologize again. There's another controversy that people may not know as much about, but to me, it speaks to the ways in which Black comics have to wrestle with something that Cruz mentioned, which is questions of authenticity. That is not just sincerity. Is there a truth between what I am saying and what I'm joking about, but also racial authenticity, real Blackness. Now, I'm going to put quotes around that because who is to say what real Blackness is? But I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that Black audiences are looking at Kevin Hart to say, are you still connected to us? Are you still tethered to us? And this is not new to Kevin Hart. It's also something that Bill Cosby and others had to kind of wrestle with. Kevin got in trouble because he tweeted some comments that reeked of colorism, the preference for lighter skin over darker skin in the African-American community. That's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. And so Black women came for him. And Kevin, so astute, and his crew, the Plastic Cup Boys, staged a set in one of his recorded stand-up albums of Black women literally coming for him around those kinds of issues. So there are ways where what you tell on a stage with a single microphone coming from you and just jokes can land in a way where people hear it and they feel some kind of way, because to some extent, yes, you might be representing yourself, but because if your jokes speak louder, say Chris Rock making jokes about Black folks versus the N-word in a predominantly African-American field stadium, you can just be brought up to account for those kinds of jokes and how those jokes can lend themselves to promoting Eurocentrism in the case of Kevin Hart's jokes about colorism, or in the case of Chris Rock, be co-opted by the right to say something about so-called N-words as being deserving of their, fates. And Wayne can tell it better, maybe Cruz can too, but there's just something that has happened to stand-up comedy with the rise of social media and the internet. And there are folks who may not like what you say, and they can come for you and they can cancel you or try to, and they may or may not be successful. And that intrigues me almost as the fact, and this is my final comment, that comics can also participate in the business of canceling other people too, and some of the critiques that they made and the momentum that they build around those critiques. So one of the reasons why stand-up comedy is so special is because stand-up comics are also quite powerful.
What are, I mean, we can open this up and Lanita or Wayne or Cruz can answer also, but as always, but what are some examples? I mean, we talk so much about cancel culture with comedy these days, but are there examples? Have people had their comedy come to a close almost, or like very altered what they're doing comedy wise, or is stand-up so powerful that it's not going to happen? Is stand-up so powerful that it is a strong enough force against whatever online communities are coming for a comedian and what they're saying?
Yeah. I'll say something and then I'll be done on this question. One is what's his name? Louis.
Louis C.K.?
Yeah, Louis C.K., right? Louis, Louis, he did some things in front of women and that came out. But he's still working. He's still working. I think he had a certain kind of penance. But there is also the great still with us, but late when we think comedically, maybe his sun will rise again, but Michael Richards is, right? Michael Richards had that moment at the Laugh Factory where he felt he was being heckled by a very diverse group, and he used the N-word repeatedly, and he landed that ER. Chris Spencer says, avoid the ER in the N-word if you want to stay out of the ER, the emergency room. Well, Michael landed it and has been paying for that ever since.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of Ralphie May and his trouble with the indigenous community, and thinking about cancel culture and like the literal sense of what shows get canceled. He had done a bit really roasting indigenous communities, and I'm not sure where it's from, but where it got picked up from was an indigenous hip hop group, I think called Savage Family. Posted, or not posted, but on their album, one of the tracks is Ralphie May's bit, really like just going in on them. And when that was, I think that was picked up by another indigenous comedian and reposted to YouTube. And then the backlash happened, and he actually had a lot of his shows canceled and needed to reach out to the Indigenous communities to say that, you know, to A, give context to the joke, but also explain that even with context, why was he making that joke, et cetera. And even with the Ralphie May example, this can tie back to, you know, how social media is affecting things, but it's very rare nowadays that we actually encounter these jokes and these punchlines, you know, within the context of a live show or in the entire specials themselves. A lot of the times they're reposted as snippets to YouTube, or we can see them as like tweets, or we get these flashes, right? And in those flashes, there's not a lot of opportunity for comedians to build trust and really build like work the room. We can't work the room if people that are considered in the room are all over the globe, right? And so that presents a lot of different challenges of like, okay, I heard the punchline, I didn't hear the setup. Yeah. And since I don't know anything about surrounding this, I'm not sure what to make of the comedian's intentions, right? And so there's a lot of rupture of trust there. And I think without that trust, you can't really have comedy bring people together. It actually has the opposite effect because like there's a lot of confusion there.
Wayne, you want to hop in?
Well, I mean, this is such a fraught topic that all I can say is there's been people protesting comedians. Back to the early 1900s, there were people that were protesting. There was blackface comedians. There was obviously Frederick Douglass had these incredible things he was saying about that, you know, over 100 years ago. And comedy used to be way more ethnic than it is now. And there were people that were protesting vaudeville comedians. So this has been going on a long time. What's different now is obviously the power of, now instead of 20 people in Cleveland who are upset with the vaudeville guy, there's thousands of people all over the world that share that same point of view that can attack that comedian. So it feels like, oh, whoa, this is happening. And so, I mean, there's a reason blackface comedy doesn't exist anymore. That was very popular in the mid 1800s. So we as a society were like, let's stop this. And I don't think there's anyone like, oh, why can't we get blackface comedians back? It's just, no one is saying that. So, so there's two things that are going on. The comedians have to perform in front of the crowds now. They have to make these people laugh. And obviously social norms change over time. I'll give you a perfect example. It's a little outside of stand-up, but shows like Friends or Seinfeld, which were extremely popular sitcoms when they were on in the 90s. Now, just Google problematic Seinfeld or problematic Friends or something like that. And you'll see like, okay, now maybe these jokes about whatever, overweight people or, you know, so just society changes. And I just want to say that I feel like stand-up comedy, I know you want to say it changes society. I feel like stand-up comedy more reflects society than changes it, because we have to live with the audiences that are out there now. So that's my take. And I'll leave it with this, that George Carlin once said about being offended. He said that it's the comedian's job to find out where the line is, and that's where someone would find something offensive, and then deliberately go over the line. That was the job of the comedian. Now, that's not the job of every comedian. Some of us are very easygoing. We don't go anywhere near the line. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting point of like that comedians need that latitude to be offensive as well. So, and that's it. That's it.
That was kind of exactly my next question. Are comedians responding to society, or are there examples of, you know, comedians because of their work literally changing people's minds or asking the questions? I mean, I'm sure that there are. Does anyone come to mind that, you know, that it's so strongly in that camp?
Not of this decade. I mean, I'm thinking of Dick Gregory.
Yeah, I mean, let's
in terms,
yeah,
because Dick Gregory was, you know, he's the first Black male comedian to perform at the Playboy Club to a room of white Southerners, right? And a lot of his success had to do with his strategy around how do I bring these issues that I want to talk about to this audience even though the audience might not have be receptive to it, right? And so how can I reflect things to society that society doesn't want to see?
Yeah.
And he was able to translate his work in stand-up into an actual career in, or just actual activism. You know, he went out and was actually marching and translated his sort of skills on stage to activism and really brought that, changed people's mind in that capacity. I think now, one thing I kind of wanted to bring up was the podcast, like how many comedians have podcasts, because I think that's a way that comedians nowadays are positioning themselves in almost every kind of social discourse outside of the stage, where there's less pressure to maybe get a laugh, but maybe more opportunity to just have this kind of free form discussion, right? So I mean, I think every comedian has a podcast nowadays. It's very rare to find a comedian that doesn't, but I mean, just off the top of my head, Joe Rogan, everyone, even if you don't listen to the podcast, you know, he has a podcast, right? And so every kind of topic can kind of run through that. And I think that's a different way comedians are trying to engage people, maybe in a kind of depressurized way outside of the performance space.
Pressurized. I like the description of that. I mean, I kind of wonder if part of it in terms of changing society or influencing society can be just the identity of the stand-up comic. I mean, that's a little bit of the work that you do, Lanita, right? That you've written about. You talk about authenticity, and I mean, I assume that is a huge part of it is the identity, regardless of the words that they're saying. Because we've talked about the power and the presence that you need as a stand-up comedian. Is that part of it just by just the identity of the stand-up comic? Is that part of what's coming to play here?
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but presence Bill Cosby in this regard, because it brings to the fore questions of not just authenticity. And again, remember, when I'm talking about authenticity, I'm talking about notions of real Blackness and the like, which I think Cosby nodded to all the time, but also got to the point where he was so universal that you just wanted to hear what he had to say, because he's a tremendously gifted comic and actor. But I think the question of sincerity comes to the fore, because in some ways Bill Cosby got canceled, not necessarily because of something he said on stage, but because of egregious instances that were happening, affecting women for many generations. And I think the pain that a lot of people had to reconcile with was the translation between his comedic persona and his television persona as this kind of noble father figure, and someone who could commit some of the rapes that he had done off screen. So yes, there are ways in which authenticity can be very significant, but then there are also ways in which what Cruz was talking about, what is that distinction between how you present on stage, what you say you're supposed to be, and how you are off stage. I think because of social media and the like, and because of cell phones, people can always be searching for these discrepancies between what people say and what people do, and they can forget something that Wayne knows full throttle, and that is that comics in some ways are themselves when they're on stage, but they're also projecting what they need to project to get the laugh. I'm not even sure I answered your question, Kirstin.
No, thank you. I like to hear it.
No, I mean, I want to just piggyback on that. I mean, there's no better example than Moms Mabley, who created an entire character on stage. So is that less authentic than what, say, Amy Schumer's doing? I don't know. I mean, this is all I know is they're both standing on stage trying to get laughs. And like I'm going to also second what Lanita said, that's the beauty of this art form, if you want to use the word art on it. But I'm also thinking a little about, because there is a limit, and this piggybacks on what Cruz was saying about podcasting. There is sort of a limit to what you can do with stand-up, because there is the expectation of getting laughs, and you just don't want to be lecturing a crowd the entire time. You want to be entertaining the crowd. That's what comedy is. So I'm thinking about what Hannah Gadsby did with her special Nanette, where she literally in the middle of a stand-up special, so she has this, this this forum that everyone agrees what the rules are. She was like, what I need to talk about for me and my lived experience, stand-up comedy does not cut it. I can't be trying to constantly get laughs from you, the audience, and feel like I'm really expressing what I need to experience. And she stops in the most special and talks about these experiences she had growing up. And so it's powerful. Is it stand-up? I mean, it's a version of it. It's done in the form of it. And then I just thought that was very interesting. And I really feel like there's a direct line between what she did and what Dick Gregory did in the 60s when he just stopped working in nightclubs for the most part and just was like, oh, you need me in Selma? Do you need me in Birmingham? Do you need me down here? I'm going to do that. And those dates opened up for other comics.
Yeah.
So it was, I feel like even though he brought levity to those situations, was like, what I'm doing, working the Playboy Club in Chicago is not really helping what I want to do. That was my feeling. I don't know, Cruz, you.
About Nanette, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I think about it all the time. And it was years ago. I mean, it was really powerful because of, she has an incredible comic voice. And I guess and then breaking away from that, I thought was really powerful. Cruz, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just on Nanette, thinking about how one of the things she says, this tension is yours. I'm not going to do anything about this tension for you. And when theorists, when scholars are talking about stand-up, that tension is really the thing that's getting diffused, right? Or the thing that people are trying to bring to the table and then play with, in a sense. And we see there are so many different examples of when that goes bad, it lapses into violence. I think comedy and violence have a very interesting relationship to one another, particularly it's coded into the language that we use to describe it. When you do well, you knocked them dead, you killed that. Yeah. And then if you did wrong, you bombed and you brought us all along with you, right? So there's this way that that language of violence is kind of coded into stand-up itself. And one other thing I was going to say in relation to the limits of comedy in relation to where it's performed, because I see one of our questions is outside the comedy clubs in the 90s, the alternative comedy scene brought comedy into coffee shops and bookstores, and stand-up got a little bit more experimental, where you could play with maybe more anecdotal, autobiographical things, or you could try different characters. There was something about the actual comedy clubs that produced a type of comedy. And I think comics responded to that and said, I want to try something else. And part of that was changing the location. So I think stand-up, one of the things that I've learned about stand-up is it's so sensitive to where it's performed, to who it's performed. Yep. These are all elements that comprise a performance in and of itself. And I think that's important to remember when we're trying to evaluate, the rightness or wrongness of a particular joke or special or set or what have you.
I'm going to look in the chat. We have questions.
Yes. Let's do it.
Live studio audience. All right. Let's see here. Okay, so Benjamin, let's go with Benjamin. Benjamin says, can stand-up comedy be harmful as well as liberating? This is kind of what you just touched on, Cruz. Can laughter or humor and the rhetorical power of the comedian be used to marginalize other people? If so, how can or should there be boundaries set over content, or should comedy be anything goes regardless of who may be offended? All right, so at its heart, can comedy be harmful? Are there examples of that? Yeah, Wayne. Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course it can, and we've all seen, very biting things said about groups of people, and but the second part of it is I don't think there should be boundaries set. And I know this is something we talk about in our program over at School of Dramatic Arts, which is something called punching down, which is where the comedian in a certain power structure of the United States is not allowed to make jokes about people who are maybe less powerful for them or seem less powerful for them. I don't agree with that, but I know a lot of comedians are just like, I don't want to do any comedy that's not I'm only punching up at the most powerful presidents, congressmen, senators, people who can actually do something, as opposed to, my gardener. I don't want to be making fun of that. And again, that's a personal choice, but I'm a believer that you can make fun of comedians. The whole beauty of it all is that comedians, one of the few people that can look at everything in life, from the worst thing, cancer, Holocaust, anything. And anything is on the table if you're creative enough to get a laugh out of it and have a, through your comic lens, a perspective on it. So I don't think there's anyone who agrees that comedy can't be harmful to people. But the question is exactly what Cruz said: to who and under what context, and what does, and also, like, what is the comedian? What is his intent or her intent with this joke? Is it to harm, or is it just to get a laugh?
Mm.
That's my feeling.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Cruz or Lanita?
Yeah, so
Cruz.
I was thinking immediately of, what's an example of harmful comedy, and you can go straight to, any racist caricature of a type of person that reduces them to, some kind of absurd caricature of themselves,
Which was
right?
not uncommon until really very recently, honestly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why Mom's Maybelline's too is so important, because she was a character, but she understood that for Black Americans and for Black comedians, a lot of characters were just racist caricatures, right? So she was building a character that really voice, right? And was able to bring that to the forefront. And I think I'm forgetting the second half of this question, of the limits. Thinking of Dick Gregory. I learned so much from comedians. But Dick Gregory had said in an interview that part of your material is limited by your identity, right? And the examples he used was, if you're a rich person, it doesn't make any sense for you to make jokes about being poor. Or if you're a particularly really pretty person, you can't really go on stage and say you're ugly, right? And so that was his strategy for trying to find ways to bring things, to find the line, but figure out where that line was in relation to him and his identity. So I think that's something to keep in mind, where it's like, I think nowadays people get in trouble because there's things that don't even relate to them. Like, I'm thinking, Andrew Dice Clay, Sam Kinison in the 80s, making gay jokes, which wasn't really even part of their brand, which was more like rock and roll, like women, that kind of thing. And so there's this kind of confusing thing of what is your actual investment in these topics? And I think that's what audiences pick up on, where there's are you actually telling us something that you believe about these communities, or are you, just looking for a laugh? That's something that can get distinguished.
Can we talk briefly about Dave Chappelle and recent remarks, mostly about the transgender communities? This comes up, and my students bring this up a lot. It's really important to a lot of people. What is the vibe on that, I guess? Or how should we respond?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like Dave Chappelle is, I'm sorry to, real quickly, I feel like Dave Chappelle is a perfect example of what's going on in stand-up. It's the shining example, in that two competing values are clashing. One competing value is free speech. We want to hear what Dave has to say. It might offend us. We may disagree, but we want comedians to have the latitude. When I buy a ticket to see Dave Chappelle, what's on your mind, Dave? Let's do this. The other competing value is, you don't want people who go to a show or watch a special to feel bad because they feel like they're being unfairly attacked or characterized in an unfair way. So these are two competing values. No one wants to hurt anyone's feelings, but we also want free speech. And so when these things collide, we get what's happening with Dave Chappelle. That's the way I look at it. Lanita, what do you think? Am I close?
Oh, yeah, you are. And closer than I'll ever touch, because I never took a stage with a mic and was charged with making someone laugh. I appreciate the difference as a scholar of stand-up comedy as opposed to stand-up comics. But Dave Chappelle, I just got through talking about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And She is a famous Nigerian author, and she found herself embroiled in controversy when two students she mentored, maybe one of whom may have been trans, maybe both, but accused her of being transphobic, and actually it said people should come after her with machetes, where she was so hurt by it that hurt kind of morphed into anger, and she ended up penning a response to it. And she affirmed her comments and tried to add some more nuance. She said, look, what I said at the time is that there's a distinction between trans women and the category that people call cis women. And it might be important for us to appreciate those differences. Then she realized, I'm living in a moment where people are dying because they're trans. People are looking at them and deciding, I don't like the way you're trying to move around. Your gender is not fluid. Gender is fixed. And I want to now hurt you. And so she came back and she said, what I should have said is that trans women are women insofar as gender fluidity, and that's how they identify. Why? Because she was realizing that in this current milieu where transphobia kills people, I need to put the emphasis here. And I think that Dave was trying to do something similar on a comedy stage. And we could ask questions about the way that he did it. He has a trans friend, or he has a gay friend, and that friend loves him, so he's not transphobic. And but I think he was trying to usher in a conversation about those kinds of distinctions. And I think what Wayne just said is very important, and also Cruz too, is that, gosh, I don't know how this is going to come off, but Kevin Hart said something in one of his last two specials, and he was like, the audience, you guys have ruined it for me. You guys have just made it harder to do what it is that we do, And just as we're asking these questions about comics, I wonder if those of us who are in the audience of comedy clubs might appreciate that some of the jokes that we may have laughed at 10 years ago, we're not laughing at the same way. Any joke that sneaks up on anything that casts aspersions on me too, it just doesn't land on my ear in the same way. Whereas in years past, I would have been chuckle, 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 And so I think this question could be expanded out to not only grapple with how have comics changed, but also how have audiences changed, and how do we mature in certain kinds of ways where comedy has appeals to us or not.
Let's ask that. And someone in the audience did also. It says, how is audience sensitivity changing? That's where the line is for stand-up. I mean, you did kind of answer that. People, I mean, comedy is arguably the fastest dying art form. That's not correct. How am I trying to say? Wayne, it's the most short-lived art form, right? It does not.
Oh no, yeah, I agree with this. Comedy, stand-up
comedy
comedy is ethereal. It doesn't have a long shelf life. It's for the here and now. So exactly, even Lanita was like, oh, something I laughed at 10 years ago, I'm not laughing at it. And that's again back to my whole Friends analogy, and that audiences change, but they've always been. This is nothing new. Audiences have always been changing and evolving, and comedians either adapt or they fade away and are replaced by some other comedian that can make this audience laugh. So the line, I think, does change, whatever that is. But again, I think we should celebrate comedians who risk being offensive. Again, I'm the least offensive comedian. I do Taco Bell material. But my point is, there's comedians that really push that thing, and I enjoy them, even if it's against my sensibility as a human being. I enjoy if it's a well-structured joke. So it's all about that, and it's different for every comedian. So I just want people to say, this is my thing, is a lot of people are like, oh, that's not funny. I think people should start saying, that's not funny to me. Which is a little different than that's not funny, because now you're saying, oh, I'm responsible for my worldview and the box I'm going to allow myself to laugh in. And if you think that's not funny, you're basically saying that's not funny for everyone. And then you're a egomaniac, because suddenly your idea of where the boundaries of comedy are should be for everyone. All right. I'm done talking about that. Cruz, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to distinguish between the live audience and the online audience.
Yes.
Because I think with a live audience, there's a level of prep work and actually like, being in line for the club, and then you sit down, you get your drinks. There's a level of like preparation that you get like before like the material comes at you. Whereas online, these things can come like at any time during the day. Going back to Dave Chappelle, I haven't seen the special, but I know the punchline or the line, I'm Team Turf. And so without like even seeing the special, without any, I didn't buy a ticket to that show, but yet I'm still getting the jokes are leaking out. And so I think it's important that like, when are comedians crossing the line, and when has the line found me when I wasn't at the show? There's something like kind of strange there. And then another thing on the internet, which, I'm trying to think through now, is the internet troll. The person who, the anonymous figure online who feigns outrage, because there is something very lucrative about outrage on the internet. You can publish articles about it. You can, get engagement, and engagement is, money, and essentially. So where are we actually, it's just interesting, how can we actually gauge, where a special actually landed with people? Versus reactions that might actually be part of this larger social media kind of machine. And do we have any, tools to actually make those distinctions? It's hard.
Yeah.
Great point, Cruz.
Yes. It's something I think the working kind of academic theory of humor is the concept of benign violation. And so for something to be funny, it has to violate you and be gentle enough to not kill you. And that's going to vary from person to person very much. And there's a lot of nuance to that. All right. So forward facing, we're almost at the end of our hour here, but let's see. We have one more question from John that I think can kind of point us toward the future in terms of stand-up's influence on society. At the grassroots in the clubs, but we can expand it to online. Do you see fewer young people aspiring to do stand-up than 10 or 20 years ago, presumably due to cancel risk, or is the occupation of being a comedian as attractive as ever before? What's the state of comedy these days, everyone?
That's a tough one.
Well, I mean, to me, that's an easy one. I feel like there's more people who want to be comics now than ever before. And when I started, there were tons of people that wanted to be comics. It's a very lucrative at the high end of it. And it's an incredible life where you're bringing joy to people each night, and you get to be a big shot, and you work an hour a night. It's one of the greatest jobs ever created. And most people's biggest fear is standing up on a stage talking to people, let alone with the expectation of trying to get laughed. Just talking is more than death for a lot of people. So it's a very difficult thing to do at a high level. And I think people are flooding into it still with something to say. And I feel like every generation has created great, incredible comics. So I'm not worried about it in the least.
Especially, I imagine that even if you're not getting to the clubs, like people are doing versions of a stand-up routine on TikTok, it's maybe not the same, but it's certainly adjacent. What state of comedy, Lanita? Or Cruz? Yeah, are the people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, since you brought up TikTok, I've been thinking about, TikTok is kind of like a new digital vaudeville where there's just all these variety acts that you can kind of just endlessly scroll through. But there's also, character work coming back. The Terry Joe's live feed is hilarious, and it's people, interacting with this person doing a character, and it's some of like the funniest snippets. Yeah, right. But that's also something interesting about like it's comedy, but it's also character, and yet it's live. And so I think, that people are finding ways to, engage each other via laughter, even if it's not necessarily just behind the mic.
Okay. Oh yeah, Lanita, please.
Yeah, I'm just saying I agree. I feel very privileged to have been in the clubs proper. Can I just say that? The clubs proper from 2001 to 2008. It's a whole different animal. But certainly during the pandemic, it was beautiful to see all the various forms of humor coming to us online.
Can I bring this full circle to the first answer from Lanita, which was at Thanksgiving, listening to adults listening to humor. So in a way, like the internet, those people weren't in a club that were downstairs in that basement listening to that. So that was already once removed from the situation. And so all throughout the history of stand-up, I always say that stand-up comedians are like pornographers. They adapt to technology very quickly. So whether that was radio or television or the records or now the internet or TikTok or podcasting or any of that stuff, and microphones, electric microphones, all of that stuff, comedians always tend to be fast and nimble adapters.
Okay, last question, really fast. Is there a current stand-up comedian working now, maybe an up-and-coming that you are especially drawn to, that you enjoy, that you'd recommend? Cruz.
I'll say Bo Burnham.
Oh, Burnham. Okay.
Bo Burnham, yeah.
Okay. Lanita.
I'll say the gentleman who availed himself for, I don't know, no less than 2 years to meet with me weekly to talk about stand-up comedy, Maranzio Vance.
Nice. Okay.
Great,
Wayne.
great. There's a comedian named Sam Morrell who he's starting to pick up a little bit, and I just think he's a wonderful old school joke writer. Really, very, very thrilling to watch him. But that's it. That for a young guy. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you all so much. I learned a lot. I've never done stand-up comedy. I appreciate you all. I want to say if there's any undergraduates watching, the USC School of Dramatic Arts has a comedy minor that I think literally every single USC student should take. You get to take class from Wayne and from me. And go watch some stand-up comedy, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Everybody.